Welcome, everyone. I think it's time to start. We're so happy to be learning with you here today at Drisha. Today we have, sadly, our last class, but very exciting class, Angels Amongst Us with Rabbanit Sara Wolkenfeld. Over to you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. I am a little sad, as Lena said, that this is the last class. There's a lot more that could be said about angels, maybe should be said about angels, but I am excited for this one. As I mentioned last week, these are really some of my favorite sources. I think I said that every time, but this time I really mean it. We're going to focus this week on angels and the everyday. Some of the ways that angels are described as being part of our lives on a day-to-day basis in rabbinic literature. And in that context, I want to spend most of our time on prayer because it's one of the ways that angels are brought into our Jewish ritual lives, and also because I think that it speaks to this idea that if angels are around us all the time, it makes that much more sense that they would make it into our tefillot, into our prayers. And I'll mention again that at the bottom of this source sheet, as at the bottom of the source sheets the last 2 weeks, there is a link for an angels graffiti page. So if you want to share a favorite text about angels that wasn't covered in this series of classes, which again, there are many, or angel songs or angel poetry, please feel free to put it there. Tonight, I'll issue a special request. You can add there, or you can put in the chat, the Facebook chat, the Zoom chat, wherever you're located. If you want to think for a moment about prayers that are addressed to angels. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but there are some. So think about that. I won't push people too hard to participate, but think about that as we get back into the mood of our session. So the source sheet is, I think, already in the it's in the Facebook chat, right? I'm going to put it in the Zoom chat also, just in case, so people can see it there. Let me grab it. And we're going to start. I'm not going to share my screen yet. I want to just bring us back to where we ended last week. Last week, we were focused on the competitive nature of angels versus human beings, or maybe specifically versus the Jewish people. And we ended with a piece from the Gemara in Chulin. I won't reread it, but again, just to set the mood, I want to remind you of it. We located prayer, tefillah, as one of the areas in which the Jewish people are in competition with the angels. And we learned from this Gemara in Chulin last week that the Jewish people are more beloved. The language of the Talmud is Chavivin Yisrael Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yoter Mimalachei Hasharit, that we are more beloved by God than the angels, I think is the implication, because we pray both more frequently than the angels do. Apparently, angels pray and humans pray, but we pray more frequently. And we are better at praying than they are. We have better word order in our prayers. There's a number of factors listed in this Gemara that make us better prayers. The angels, are closer to the source in some ways, but we are somehow better at it. And so Chazal have a complicated relationship with the idea of angels being involved in prayer. And as a spoiler alert, we do have prayers to angels, right? We do know, or you may know, I should say, from your ritual life, that angels are often depicted as being involved in prayers. So again, if you have a favorite tefillah or just any prayer that occurs to you that you know calls upon angels, I invite you to put that in the chat. I might mention some as we go on. It's definitely a part of certain tefillot, certain services that are said during the year in a traditional prayer service, and they're contentious. It's not always so clear. What is clear is that Jews have been praying, I don't know if I want to say to angels, maybe through angels. Jews have been invoking angelic names in prayer, I'll say it that way, for a very, very long time. And if you want to read more about this, it's a little bit outside the scope of what we're going to talk about tonight. But I recommend, there's a book by a scholar named Mika Ahuvia, which is about angels, broadly speaking, and she did a lot of research on late antiquity and incantation bowls that were in Jewish households specifically, and in which the people writing the bowls or the people using the bowls, not only bowls, other incantations also, were clearly appealing to angels. So there's this long history around it, but it's definitely a tension. Sometimes we'll see that rabbinic sources are opposed, that Chazal are opposed to the idea of relying on angels, thinking too much about angels, praying to angels, imagining angels around us. And other times it seems that there's a great amount of comfort in that. And what I want us to think about tonight is, why might angels make great intercessors for us? Why might they make great neighbors for us? Why might they not? What are the advantages or disadvantages of involving angels in our prayer process and in our day-to-day lives in general? And I want to start with what might be a familiar text. It's a great example of resistance against angels, only I'm not sure that we typically think of it that way. I'm going to share my screen now. There's a moment in the Haggadah, in the Passover Haggadah, in Magid, the section where we are extensively telling the story. We read a verse from Sefer Dvarim that God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, etc., etc. And the Haggadah adds, Lo al yedei malach, v'lo al yedei saraf, v'lo al yedei shaliach, ela hakadosh baruch hu bichvodo uve'atzmo. It wasn't an angel, it wasn't a seraph, which might be a kind of angel, it wasn't a messenger. Rather, it was God, God's own self. And the Haggadah goes on to drive home the point when it says, Va'avarti v'eretz Mitzrayim b'leil hahu, that God passed through Egypt on that night and smote every firstborn among the Egyptians. So that verse ends, Ani Hashem, I am the Lord your God. So the Haggadah enumerates, Va'avarti v'eretz Mitzrayim b'leil hazeh, ani v'lo malach. I passed through Egypt, or I will pass through Egypt on that night. Not I myself, God, and not an angel. And each clause is interpreted that way. Not a saraf, not a shaliach, not any kind of angel, not any kind of messenger. I am God and there is no other. Which maybe, arguably, you can argue with me, in the context of the Haggadah, is a really powerful affirmation of the role of God, the role of the one true God in, I would say, our biggest moment of truth, arguably, as the Jewish people. It's this moment where it's the ultimate redemption. It's the event of the evening. Right? This is what we're all here to commemorate when we're sitting at the Passover Seder, and we are reassuring ourselves, reassuring each other, who was it who did this incredible miracle for us? It was definitely God. Now, excuse me while I go a little bit down a Passover rabbit hole. These might be conversations that are not, don't feel comfortable this time of year. But I would say that there are some obvious flaws in this argument that I think we pass over. How's that? We tend to ignore them while we're caught up in the rhythms of the Passover Seder. So the obvious one, and the one that commentators tend to spend time on, is this idea of ani v'lo shaliach, right? Not me and not a messenger, God says, which is interesting because obviously there was a messenger of God there. His name was Moshe. He's famously not emphasized in the Pesach Haggadah, and so that's something that gets a lot of airtime. What I think is less talked about is the fact that in order to really fully buy this piece of the Haggadah, you have to ignore or somehow account for large quantities of biblical text. So, for example, in Exodus 23, Shmot Chaf Gimel, God says, Hinei anochi shaleach malach lefanecha, lishmarcha baderech v'lahaviecha el hamakom asher hachinoti. God says, I'm sending a messenger before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have gotten ready. God specifically says, repeatedly in this passage, that God has sent an angel in order to guide the Jewish people. In Sefer Bamidbar, Vanitza'ak el Hashem vayishma kolenu, vayishlach malach v'yotzienu miMitzrayim. Doesn't really get that much more explicit than that. The people say, we cried out to God. God heard our voice, and what did God do? God sent, this translation says a messenger, you could argue an angel. God sent a malach who took us out of Egypt. It goes on from there. Again, in Shmot, God says to Moshe, lead the people where I told you, my malach will go before you. Malachi elech lefanecha. And again in Shmot, vayisa malach ha'elokim, right? The messenger of God or the angel of God who was going ahead of the Israelite army goes ahead of them. Again and again and again, we have this actually, what we really have is an emphasis on angels in the Psukim. And the Haggadah, the rabbis step in to say, not so fast. Don't get too comfortable with the angel imagery. It was actually God who was doing it. And presumably the explanation would be, well, when it says an angel here, it really means God, right? On some level, it really means God. The Gemara actually addresses this essentially in the Gemara in Sanhedrin. It records a conversation between a heretic, Amin, and Rav Idit. And this verse, this pasuk is stated, in this case, by a heretic. So God said to Moshe, come up to the Lord. The heretic said, it should have said, come to me. Okay, I'm skimming because I want to get to the good part. And Rav Idit says to him, Zehu Metatron. Really, it should have said Metatron. Metatron is the name of an angel. Sheshmo Kashem Rabo, whose name is like the name of the master, in this case, God, right? They can be used kind of interchangeably. As it says, Kishmi Bekirbo, right? My name is within him. And so really you can say, right, when it says like, I'm sending an angel in front of you, or I'm sending an angel to guide you, or whatever it is, you can just kind of, you can assume that is God. The angel is associated with God. Of course, you're not supposed to worship the angel. The Gemara goes on to say, don't worship the angel. There's a play on words, al tamerbo, al tamireni, don't swap me out for an angel, God says. But when it comes to sort of naming names, it's okay to use the title God for a very important angel. And that's kind of how the Gemara gets out of it. But again, I think the point remains that you see a kind of reluctance here, a kind of wishing away of the angelic role, and a focus on God as the one in control, the one in charge, the only one who can possibly redeem the Jewish people. Interesting, maybe, to think about this. Again, I'll leave Pesach behind, but interesting to think about this in the context of the Seder. The Haggadah is really extremely well put together. You can think about, how does the story change? Not necessarily the whole Exodus story, but how does the story we tell in the Haggadah change if there is an angel, if there is a malach, if there is some kind of intercessor there? How would that night feel different? How would that be different? But okay, I'll move away from Pesach and back to the larger question of angels. Again, there's really a tension, again and again we see in the Gemara, not just when it comes to the Exodus from Egypt, but what should we do about angels? And I want to say, and this is a point that multiple scholars have made. Mika Huvia makes it in her book, a few other articles on this subject as well. When you see resistance in Chazal, when you see resistance in the Gemara in Midrash to praying to angels, or to the idea that angels are around you, it's probably safe to assume that that's because people were praying to angels, or the Jewish people were making statements that assumed that angels were around them, right? They wouldn't necessarily have to resist it if it weren't a part of the culture in some way. So here you can see a text from the Yerushalmi in Brachot. Rabbi Yudan Amar Mishmei Didei, Basar V'Dam Yesho Patron. Rabbi Yudan said in his own name, flesh and blood, right? People have their own protectors. And he gives an analogy, a mashal. If you're in trouble, you don't necessarily run into your protector's house. It's polite to stand outside the door. You knock and you say, you call the servant, or you call the son of the homeowner and they say, oh, so-and-so is standing out the door waiting for you, Shema machniso v'shema manicho, because maybe they're going to let you into their house and maybe they're not. You don't totally know. You have a flesh and blood protector. You're not exactly sure, are they going to help me in this moment? You have to go through the niceties of life. You have to knock on the door. You have to wait for someone to say, can I help you? And then you say, yes, you can help me, and here's how. And maybe they'll help you and maybe they'll turn you away. But here's the flip side of the analogy. It's like a non-analogy. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu eino ken. It's not that way with God. Im ba'al adam tzara, lo yitzavach lo leMichael v'lo leGavriel, ella liyitzavach. If trouble comes upon a person, you shouldn't cry out to Michael and you shouldn't cry out to Gabriel. Famous angelic names. By the way, there are a lot of angel names. We could do a whole other class on just the names of angels. And again, if you have favorites, you're welcome to share. Some of them are quite fun. But Michael and Gabriel, I think, are at least somewhat familiar angels. They get invoked a lot. But God says, don't cry out to those angels. Cry out to me. And I, God says, answer that person immediately. And this is why it says in Sefer Yoel, everyone who calls on the name of the Eternal will escape, will be saved. But the emphasis here is don't call out to the angels. The angels are, in this story, or in the mashal nimshal model, right? If you think about this as an analogy, the angels are parallel to the flesh and blood person, which is interesting. We would maybe think about them, or we certainly talked a lot about how they're not similar to people, how they at least imagine themselves maybe as more similar to God, but sometimes in some ways they're similar to people. And so in this analogy, they are, right? They're more similar to the person who's going to I don't know, am I going to help you? Am I not going to help you? Don't cry out to an intermediary, God says, just cry out to me. And again, I would ask, okay, let's pro-con this. According to this Gemara, the pro of crying out to God is that God will answer you immediately, which I think this approach is very resonant following on the text that we learned last week. If, in fact, the angels were constantly resisting the creation of humankind and the giving of the Torah to the Jewish people, and even our prayers, they're kind of opposed to, right? They always stand in opposition. And we said last week that what these sources do is they set up an extra special relationship. It emphasizes the love that God has for human beings, the kind of, I would say, it's like a tolerant parental kind of love, right? They're not going to be the best necessarily. They're not going to do everything right. The Torah is specifically given to people who don't do everything right, or to beings that don't do everything right, and that is people. And so it's a special sign of God's love. And so given that, it might make sense that we're following up by saying, oh yeah, and by the way, God is the one you should pray to, right? God's the one with whom you have the special relationship. The angels are going to kind of hem and haw. They're not necessarily going to help you right away. They're not the address for help. On the flip side, though, it does seem that they have some power. And I would say even in this Gemara in the Yerushalmi, you see a little bit of they're not going to help you. Does that mean that they couldn't help you? Maybe it just means that you don't have this special relationship with them. But in some of the other rabbinic sources, we see more of a I would call it almost like a hedge your bets kind of approach. And you can see that in this piece in the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara is talking about this idea Rabbi Elazar presents about offering up prayer before trouble actually arrives. It's a drasha on a piece of the Avraham story. I'm going to skip over that to get to the part I want to focus on. Reish Lakish Amar, Kol ha'ma'ametz atzmo b'tfilah milamata, ein lo tzarim milamala. Anyone who puts their energy into prayer from below won't have any enemies above causing trouble. Ein lo tzarim milamala. So I think, again, if we hadn't set this up with this sort of competition between the angels and human beings, maybe we would need to spend more time on this idea of who are these tsarim milamala, who are these opponents from above. But maybe by now it won't be any surprise to you that the Gemara assumes that you could have angelic voices that are dissenting from your prayer. I think that the image that stays with me in my head, even as we're reading this Gemara, is the story that we saw last week about Moshe going to get the Torah and the angels being ready to kill him. Ad kedei kach, right? It was so extreme. They really didn't want him to get the Torah. They were willing to, destroy Moshe, which is pretty extreme, but even just the idea that the angels wanted to kill a human being just for trying to essentially get closer to God, that's a pretty extreme idea. And there's a version of that here. What are we doing when we pray, if not appealing to God, getting closer to God, etc.? And Reish Lakish is sort of testifying that if you do a really good job in prayer, no one else will shut you down. Ein lo tzarim milamala. And Rabbi Yochanan says, Le'olam yivakesh adam rachamim shehu hakol me'amtzin et kocho ve'al yehu lo tzarim milamala. Rabbi Yochanan says, I'll take it one level up. A person should always pray for mercy, that all heavenly beings should strengthen the power of their prayer, so they won't have enemies causing them trouble in heaven above. So it's maybe not enough to have just the right effort in your prayer. You might want to, Rabbi Yochanan says, you probably should include, it doesn't use the word angels, include the what's the English here? Heavenly beings, right? Include all the other powers that are up there in your prayer, just to hedge your bets, right? Just to play it safe, so that you won't have any opposition to your prayer. Again, I think this captures both the tension between human beings and angels. They might not want our prayers to be there. We might need a little help from them, or we might at least need them not to block our prayers. We'll see that in the next source. It also captures, I think, the larger tension that's at issue in this whole conversation, which is really the relationship between human beings and God. Are we so close to God? God loves us more than the angels. We don't have to worry about it. Or maybe we're both so close to God and so beloved. And also we know that there are these other beings who are kind of situated closer to God than we are in some ways. And we want to be sure to take that into account, capitalize on that, in some way deal with that every time we pause in prayer. I think it's a really, it's an interesting challenge. We'll talk about this more later on. Is it harder or easier to think about angels when you pray as opposed to thinking about God when you pray? I just mentioned in passing, Gabriel, Michael. These are maybe familiar names. Maybe you could name some other angels. Maybe there's a kind of familiarity there, a kind of closeness. We'll see later on that there's definitely sources that reflect the idea the angels are familiar, the angels are close. God is, that we don't know God's name, or we can't say God's name. God is more distant in some ways, but God is also, again, the source of this special relationship. Are there any questions or comments before I go on? No, Lilianaz is telling me no. Okay, great. So let's think more about this role of angels in tefillot. There is this ongoing debate, and one piece of the question is going to be, I'll say it this way: where and when can and can't the angels successfully be a part of the process for us? So it's almost a tangent. I thought about taking it out, but I think it's a really interesting tangent. In several places, rabbinic sources relate to the idea that maybe the angels don't speak Aramaic. Maybe the angels only speak Hebrew, or maybe they speak other languages, that's considered also, but maybe not Aramaic. It's like an actual source of debate. Do the angels speak Aramaic or not? I guess the spoiler alert short version answer is, I don't know, right? I've never spoken to one, but the Gemara is willing to debate this back and forth. So this piece from the Gemara in Shabbat is talking about Bikor Cholim, visiting the sick, visiting mourners on Shabbat. And it relates in passing that Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said that Rabbi Elazar, when he would visit sick people. Zimnin amar hamakom yifkadcha l'shalom. V'zimnin amar le rachmana yidkiranach l'shalom. Right? Sometimes, basically, he would say it in Hebrew, may God remember you for peace. And sometimes he would say it in Aramaic. How could he do such a thing? Because didn't Rav Yehuda say, a person should never ask for what they want in Aramaic. And Rabbi Yochanan says, such an interesting statement. Really curious. I mean, again, I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, but so interesting, right? Why? Like how? So the idea, as Rabbi Yochanan says, you should never, or if you ask for things you want, if you pray for things in Aramaic, the angels won't pay attention to you. They won't listen to you. And the English here reflects, right? The ministering angels don't attend to him to bring his prayer before God, right? The idea of niskakin lo, like the angels aren't going to pay attention to you. And by the way, you want the angels to pay attention to you. They can be your helpers in prayer, but not if they don't speak the language and they don't speak Aramaic. There's then an interesting digression I can't resist. The Tosfot in Brachot consider this in discussing Kaddish, maybe the most famous Aramaic prayer. And they don't accept this idea, but they raise the idea that maybe we say Kaddish in Aramaic specifically because we don't want the angels to understand it. We don't want them to be jealous that we have such a beautiful prayer, which is such great praise to God. They'd be jealous if they knew. And if you can just imagine for a minute that, Kaddish is recited, if you take all the Kaddishes, right? Just times when we're speaking Aramaic. So it's probably easily 4 or 5 times in your average Shachrit. Sometimes more on Shabbat, right? It depends a little bit on where you pray and how you pray. It's like a lot of Kaddish. So if you just imagine that tefillah is a flow, davening is a flow, and it's happening in Hebrew. And from like the angelic perspective, they're getting it, they're receiving it, they can help, they can transmit. And then there's like radio silence for the angels each and every time we stop to say Kaddish, because it's just not understandable to them. Again, Tosfot ultimately reject this idea, but I think here again, you have an idea, or you have a sense of a kind of tension. Aramaic for the Gemara is the quintessential spoken language. It's the vernacular. Everybody speaks Aramaic. That's what they speak. Hebrew, that's like a little bit more specialized, but everybody speaks Aramaic, but not the angels, right? They're different than we are. And built into this ongoing rivalry we have with them is they don't speak our language, right? They quite literally don't speak our language. But it's a little bit of a love-hate relationship. Maybe hate is too strong, maybe frenemy kind of thing, right? Because we actually need them. At the end of the day, we need them to help with prayers, or it's a good idea, right? Depending on which formulation in the Gemara you take the most seriously. It's not a bad idea to have the angels on your side when you're offering prayers. And so good news, when we pray in Aramaic, the angels don't understand us. They can't be jealous of us. They can't engage directly. And maybe that's a good thing sometimes, but also they can't help us when we're praying in Aramaic, because they can't bring those tefillot to God. They can't be involved in that at all. The Gemara about visiting the sick ultimately concludes a sick person is different, which is also, I think, a very beautiful, if tangential, idea. Shani choled shechina imo, that sick people don't need angels to bring their prayers before God because the divine presence is with them anyway. But that means those of us who thank God are well, we maybe do need the angels to bring our prayers before God. And to Rabbi Yochanan's point earlier, it's like not a bad idea, right, to have that outside help to make sure that the angels above are not opposed to your tefillot. And so to that end, it's maybe a good idea to generally pray in Hebrew, and a good idea to make sure that the angels are with us before we pray. Any questions or comments on anything before I go on? Because I feel like this is a lot. It's a lot of angels, is I think what I want to say.
It kind of makes, I have kind of a question then about personal prayer, because I'm guessing like at the time, a lot of like personal prayer would be in Aramaic, or like nowadays in English and French or whatever. Does that mean that the angels don't bring our like personal, not like written tefillot to Hashem? Like, how does that work?
It's a great question. So again, I want to offer the disclaimer that I can't actually tell you how it works, right? I have not discussed this with the angels. I can't actually tell you how it works, but I want to say, first of all, it's very interesting that it seems it's not that they only understand Hebrew, it's that they only don't understand Aramaic. So the English thing, right? Pray in French, pray in English, pray in German. It's not clear that even this source would think that that's a problem. And to the other part of your points about like, well, what if they prayed in Aramaic? So I can't prove this, but my hunch is that that's a feature and not a bug. If you tell people, sure, you can pray, right? You can recite your own personal prayers, but also, by the way, we have this fixed liturgy that we're pretty into, and we'd like you to say it. And by the way, it's in Hebrew, right? So, and by the way, if you speak Aramaic, like do what you want, but the angels won't understand you. Again, that seems to me like arguably a plus for the rabbis. I think that it's maybe a little counterintuitive, but then again, I'm not sure. I think it depends on intuitive for whom. In other words, I think that there's a sense of like, well, God understands every language, so I should be able to pray in whatever language feels most resonant for me, right? Obviously, I should be able to do that because that's how prayer works and that's how God works. And I'm using prayer to get close to God. And I think, that's real. That's sort of a resonant perspective on prayer. And then there's this maybe other take, which is, well, I am getting closer to God, or I want to get closer to God, but the angels feel maybe like much more immediate presences. Yeah, right. They feel like a much more immediate presence. And so, isn't it easier? Isn't it better on some level if I can connect with the angels, or more convenient, or just more, I want to use the word tangible, not to suggest that angels are in fact tangible, but like closer, right? A little bit closer to being tangible. And I think that would be the trade-off you would have to consider if you were thinking about, again, like what language should I pray in, right? Do I want the angels to understand, or do I not want the angels to understand? Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
I think we have one in the chat.
Oh, yes. Now, I was saying, seems like something structural that might help people to be more monotheistic in their thoughts and behaviors. The line between an angel and a tiny deity. Yeah, I mean, I do think that that's a danger or a question or something that let's say proponents of angels have to contend with, right? Like if you just see an angel, as we talked in our first class about malach as a variation on the word melacha, angels have a mission from God. So they can only carry out that mission. So it's like, it's okay, don't worry, they're not so close to being like God. But yeah, on the flip side, they have power. They're closer to God. So what exactly does that mean? And saying, oh, only pray to God, or only God can truly understand your prayers or can truly answer your prayers, might kind of help with monotheism. And yet, again, I think you have a strong track record by now of people turning towards God. It's okay. People turning towards God, but wanting some more immediate presence, right? Wanting the angels in some way and for some reason. And again, you really do see that again and again in these sources. Even as, again, we're sort of preserving this kind of angelic versus human tension or competition. So if you look at the next source, I'll share my screen again. Just kind of the flip side of what we've been talking about above. This is a piece from the Yerushalmi from the Jerusalem Talmud. It's essentially a midrash about King Menashe, who was one of the bad kings of Yehuda. And so there's a pasuk that says that God spoke to Menashe and to his people, and they didn't listen. But then eventually Menashe does seem to feel bad about what he's done. So the Gemara says, Kivan shara shetzara totzara lo hiniach avodah zara ba'olam shelo hizkira. He realized he was in real trouble. He actually didn't forget about avodah zara. He delved to idols, but that didn't work. So he said, oh, I remember that my father used to take me to the Beit Knesset, b'tzar lacha u'metzucha kol hadvarim ha'ela, ba'acharit ha'yamim v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha v'shamata b'kolo. And his father would tell him, when you're in trouble and all these things find you in the future, right at the end of days, you'll return to God and listen to God's voice. And because God is merciful and powerful, etc. And so basically Menashe has this like childhood memory and says, okay, I'm going to try it. I'm going to call out to God. And here's what happened. The angels shut the windows, which I take to mean not the windows of Menashe's home, but somehow that there's like, heavenly windows through which prayer enters, where they perform some process so that Menashe's prayer won't go before God. And they even say to God, God, Adam she'avad avodah zara v'hemid tzelem b'heichal atam mekablo b'tshuva. A person who worshipped idol worship and put an idol in the temple or in the town hall, you're gonna take that person back. You're gonna take that person back, in repentance. You should close the door. You should lock the door. That's the angel's position, which I think, just pausing the story there for a second, first of all, gives you a great idea of why you wouldn't want the angels to not be on your side. And the other sources emphasize the flip side, right? The angels could help you in prayer. They could be your allies. Here's an image of what happens if they're against you, which I think is different to your point, Lilina, as it's different than them not understanding, right? That's just like they can't help you. This is what happens if they understand and they think you're not deserving. They can actually try to shut out your tefillot. And I love the end of this story. Me'asalo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what did God do? Chatarlo chatira mitachat kisei hakavod shelo v'shamat chinato. God dug a tunnel underneath God's throne of glory and thereby accepted Menashe's prayer and allowed him to return in Shuvah. God couldn't open the windows because the angels had closed the windows. The only way God could, as it were, get around the angels is by digging a tunnel, is by secretly making space. I would say it's quite literally making space for the prayer of someone whose tefillah, whose prayer doesn't meet with the approval of, should we say, like the heavenly choir, right? The angels are not okay with this prayer. Only God is. And I think you see here echoes of the sources that we read together last week. God has this special relationship with us. God is willing, they say like, go where angels fear to go, but it's God, right? God is willing to go where the angels fear to go. God is willing to take this, it's kind of a risk, right? Take a risk on a sinner. God's willing to do that. The angels are not willing to do that. But again, to our point for this week's class, the angels have real power to stop up prayers. I asked you earlier for your favorite prayer to angels. I don't know if anyone wants to shout one out in the chat, in any of the chats, but I think that in a moment I'll name a few. I'll give people a minute to put them into the chat if they want to. Once you have this imagery, I'd say like this taken together with the sources we looked at earlier, the angels can help your prayer, right? You don't want to have the angels pitted against your prayer. The angels are in control of kind of this like heavenly flow, right? They can bring prayers before God or they can shut them out. And in that case, having tefillot, like for example, I see we have one comment in the chat. Yeah, El has, oh, great. Welcoming Shabbat, Malachei Hasharit. Very contentious tefillah in some ways. So, Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hasharit, Malachei Elyon. We literally talk to the angels, pray to the angels. And by the way, what do we ask the angels for? They come, they go, but in between, we are asking them, very specifically, Baruchuni l'shalom, Malachei Hashem, right? Bless us with peace. And Lily Naz is adding the one before bed with the 4 archangels. Oh, don't worry, we will get to that. Yes, right. That's maybe the most popular example, right? I mean, Mini Michael, Mismali Gabriel, where we invoke these 4 angels. Also, famously, there's a piyut Machnise Rachamim, where we turn to the angels as Machnise Rachamim is like they are the gatherers of mercy, right? They're like conveyors of the prayer. They're conveyors, they're intercessors really before God. Pulses Zenura, Lily Naz adds, yeah, like all of these things. If you can remember back to Sukkot, not that long ago, anyone remember what we say when we pray for rain? The prayer is addressed to Af Bri, who's apparently, who knew, the angel of rain. And that tefillah, that piyut by Elazar HaKalir is very clearly addressed to Af Bri, the Sar, the angel of, or the archangel of rain. A little bit of a mystery. I mean, there's a lot of scholarship on that, but it's not like Af Bri gets a lot of airtime, right, in like the Gemara or other sources. He's kind of like an unknown. And I think it raises this question each time we do these things. It raises a question of the point that Noah raised earlier, which is, how are we feeling about our monotheism in that moment? I do think that these Gemaras do a good job of making it clear, okay, the angels have a real role to play, but God is always God, right? God is up there, God is on the throne. Ultimately, God has even a way to circumvent, right? When the angels decide not to bring the prayer before God, or not even to let the prayer in, God has a way to circumvent that. But it is true that we might feel a little squeamish, and people have felt squeamish. Certainly, Machnise Rachamim evoked a whole polemic. People might feel a little squeamish about davening to someone who is not God. Parenthetically, in case you will want to invite me back, I'll say that there's a parallel, similar but different conversation about praying to the dead, praying to tzaddikim. There are prayers. I think this is true. It definitely was true, like the big black Art Scroll Sidurim. I think still true in more recent printings. Printed in the back of your standard Sidur, you can find prayers to be recited at gravesites in which the prayer is addressed to the dead person. It is addressed to whoever is buried there, and you're praying for intercession. You're praying for help. You're praying for that person to be, we might call it a melitz yosher, right? Someone who can say good things about you before God. So we have this strong tradition, actually, of intercessionary prayer, which again is sort of parallel to, slightly different from. I'm very interested in that also, but we'll keep talking about angels. So where exactly do the angels hang out? So many places. And if you, again, sort of move through layers of the Gemara past this initial resistance, right? It's not angels, it's God. And then we said, and it's not exactly in chronological order, but you see overlapping, disagreeing voices, right? Then you see the voice that says, no, like really it'd be good to placate the angels also. They have a role to play in prayer. You also see sources that have angels, good angels, bad angels, and demons who are arguably different than bad angels around people at all times. And so the Gemara in Brachot, which is this part of Brachot is full of, I want to say like bathroom humor, like there's a lot about going to the bathroom in Brachot. So that's sort of the theme here. Hanichnas lebeit hakiseh omer, hitkabdu mechubadim kadoshim mishartei elyon. When you go into the bathroom, you should say, and the Steinsaltz adds, to the angels who accompany you at all times, because clearly there are angels that accompany you at all times, didn't you know? Be honored, honorable holy ones, mishartei elyon, servants of the Most High, tnu kavod le'elokei Israel, give honor to the God of Israel. Leave me until I enter and do my will, and then I'll come back to you. You basically ask the angels to leave you at the door to the bathroom, and you tell them, I'll be right back. Abaye says, no, people shouldn't say this, because then, not because, right, just pausing there, people shouldn't say this. Why? Because those angels don't exist, because you're praying to deities that aren't God? No, because maybe then the angels will abandon you and go, right? You don't want to say goodbye prematurely because you want the angels to stay with you. Elalema, shimruni, shimruni, izruni, izruni, simchuni, simchuni, hamtinuli, hamtinuli, ad she'ekanes ve'etzeh. Sheken darkan shel bnei adam. Instead, you say to the angels, guard me, help me, support me, wait for me, while I go in and come out. So you don't say, like, I'm leaving and I'll be right back. You specifically say, please wait for me. And I think this part is so interesting, sheken darkan shel bnei adam, because this is the way of human beings. In other words, in that moment, we're drawing attention. One of the key differences, again, as we've discussed a few times already, one of the key differences between humans and angels is our bodies, our mortal flesh, right? The fact that we have these bodily needs and angels don't have these bodily needs. And we saw that last time, I think, really powerfully expressed in the Midrashic passage in the Gemara where Moshe kind of lays it out for the angels, right? This is why we get the Torah and you don't, because we have bodies, because the mitzvot of the Torah are addressed to people, or just to beings that have bodies. And here you see, again, a recognition of that gap. Angels, you just need to wait outside the bathroom for a sec. You forget that we as people need to relieve ourselves sometimes, right? You don't have that. And then, kinafik omer baruch asher yetzaret ha'adam b'chokhmah, etc., etc. When you come out, you say this blessing, which is definitely a version of what we would call the asher yetzar blessing, the blessing that is traditionally recited after using the bathroom. That bracha, which is, again, like a standard piece of liturgy, is definitely addressed to God. You could, if you don't read this Gemara, you could put it in with, could kind of group it together with all of our liturgy, right? It doesn't seem so different. But as it's presented here, I mean, yes, you're blessing God. It's definitely clear that God is the creator here, but it's also this moment of kind of return to the angels. So when you're in the bathroom, you're away from the angels, you're away from, you're not speaking to God directly, and you've left the angels at the door. When you come out and you're reconnecting with, let's say, heavenly beings, right? That's when you can reconnect to spirituality on all levels. That's when you can pick up your angelic entourage again. And that's also when you can make this tefillah and speak to God again. And there's many, many more sources that we could look at together. We don't have time, but again, you're encouraged to put your favorite in the chat or put it on that graffiti page. I mentioned in our first class together, and I didn't repeat it here, but my favorite source about angels in our everyday lives is the story in Shabbat about the angels who accompany a person home from shul on Friday nights and kind of judge, like, is your house ready for Shabbat or not? Which, to Yael's point earlier, might be the source for the idea of singing Shalom Aleichem. So a kind of parallel source in Masechet Ta'anit, Bizman Shisrael Shruyin Batzar Upiresh Echad Mehen, when the Jewish people are upset or distressed and one person separates himself from the community and doesn't share in their suffering. Again, I really want to focus in on this part of it. I'm not as focused on the context. Two angels who accompany every person come to this person. They put their hands on his head and they say, this person who separated themselves from the community at this time of trouble, they won't merit to see the comfort, to see the good things that happen to the community. Again, the larger context is interesting, but to specifically hone in on those words, who are these angels? They are the Malachei Hasharet Shemelavin Lo La'adam. These are the angels who are always accompanying people. Do you know it? Do you not know it? Are you aware of it? Are you not aware of it? There's always two angels with you at all times. And they have, again, we see, like in the source in Shabbat, they have this kind of judgment role, not in maybe the capital J sense, but they're sort of casually passing judgment on you, right? Like similar again to that source in Shabbat, where if they see your table set, et cetera, they'll say, so may it be every week. And if they see your table not set, right, then the bad angel gets to say, so may it be every week. And in each case, the other angel has to say, amen. And again, I'll just bring us back to that question I started with. What do we gain, right? What are the advantages? We talked already a little bit about this in terms of monotheism and closeness and distance. But what do we gain from seeing the angels as being all around us? What do we gain from involving the angels in our tefillah? And I'll bring in this by way of wrapping up. And again, I'm happy for comments, questions, etc. Maybe not, it's not the only, but a midrashic source for the prayer that Lily Naz referenced. There are 4 classes or groups of ministering angels who are always praising God. The first camp is led by Michael on the right. The second group or the second class is Gavriel on the left. And then the third group is led by the angel Uriel in the front, and then the fourth camp, Raphael is behind God, and the Shekhinah is at the center. Again, thinking about this monotheistic vision, so it stays consistent, I would argue, through all these sources, unlike the folk literature that Mika Huvia deals with in her book, where God's name isn't always invoked in these different incantation processes. Here, I would say God is maybe not front, but God is center. God is clearly positioned at the center of this vision. But you have all these angels playing supporting roles on all sides of God. And again, these angels have names, right? They're named entities. They're familiar named entities. Maybe they also, the names carry meaning in some way. And that's a very powerful thing. And from this, we get the, as you mentioned earlier, the Kriyat Shema al Hamita, the bedtime Shema, where they are invoked, but invoked in the name of God. And so, Mimini Michael, Mismoli Gavriel, who's right and who's left are we talking about? I think it's interesting because in the Tefillah, or in the Shema version, it's kind of, right, I'm saying it. So it's like my right, my left. But actually, I think once you see the Midrashic context, it makes it more clear, right? Like it's also God's right, left, back, and front. And that's because God is in the center. So I'm in the center, God is in the center, right? Above my head, Shechinat Kal, right? Above my head is the presence of God. But the angels surround me, or I think I would say in this context, surround us on all sides, which is, I think maybe the most powerful version of prayers to angels. I mean, not denying that someone could have their own favorite. And again, I'm curious to hear, there are other ones also. I didn't name all of them, so no spoilers if you want to put more in the chat. But I think in some ways, this is the most powerful. Also, you could see maybe why this one is so like rabbinically sanctioned, because you have God, again, central to this tefillah. God's presence is definitely there, but you have the supporting cast of angels, and then it's not a far cry, right? It's not hard to imagine the ways in which they support the prayer, right? The one doing the praying. It's not hard to imagine that they play a supporting role in conveying prayers, in supporting prayers, in bringing prayers before God. Right? They're kind of at attention, literally at hand, right? At your right hand, at your left hand, behind you, in front of you, in order to share these prayers out, or help amplify tefillah, help amplify prayer. Pausing to see if there are questions or comments before we wrap up. No, I think that's it now. Right? You didn't say, oh, hi, go ahead.
So I know you don't want to go into right now into the meaning of the names and everything, but am I to understand that our right would also be God's right, and our
Yes.
left would also be God's left? So then you'd have Dean, where you'd have judgment at God's left.
If you because you're saying identifying Gabrielle with judgment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just want to make sure that I'm getting it straight. Thank you.
Yes. And thank you for saying that, because I do think that it's, again, at least for me, not obvious. Or I would say, like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. But I think until you read the midrashic context of that prayer, it is like is it my left? Is it my right? Is it God, right? Who's right? But actually, again, for me, at least, the angel, the midrash helps me visualize it better, right? We and God are located in the same place, just vertically aligned. But anything that's to my right is also to God's right, et cetera, et cetera. Which I think also, again, to your point, amplifies this connection, that yes, God is connected to the angels, but also we are connected to God in this very meaningful way. And here I would say, supported by the angels, but also in a way kind of transcending the angels in a sense also. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm sorry I didn't see your hand right away. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I will wrap up. I think, again, you can pick your favorite angelic tefillah. It sounds like this one might be a lot of our favorites. Although I would also put in, again, a strong vote for Shalom Aleichem, which you also raised earlier, Yael, which I think is maybe the most, I don't know, is it the most widely recited angelic prayer? Maybe, right? I feel like I would venture to guess yes. And even if many people recite it without knowing what it means or without contemplating, I want to suggest, but we can contemplate, right? It's an invitation to think about what that means. And I do think that angels can be a robust part of our Jewish lives. I mentioned in our first class that they are sometimes associated as like a little bit Christian, and they're kind of like fluffy and they sit on clouds, right? Maybe not that kind of angel, but I do think that this kind of angel can be a robust part of our Jewish lives without necessarily always being a model to emulate. We definitely saw cases in which you wouldn't want to be, right? Angelic behavior does not mean what you think it means. We are meant to glory in our own humanity and to celebrate the flaws and the lack of perfection that make us humans, beloved of God, worthy of being created, worthy recipients of the Torah. At the same time, the angels might be all around us. They might be helpers for us sometimes. Okay, we didn't get to talk a lot about bad angels. I want to warn you that they're out there also, maybe a different class. And I would say the angels aren't necessarily so much an inspiration to us. We saw a little bit of that, as they are a kind of partner for us, sometimes encouraging us and helping us, and sometimes challenging us as we build religious and spiritual lives. I think that's that challenge of where do we emulate, where do we resist, how are we similar, how are we different, is, I think, something that we gain from thinking about these angels around us. It's something we can gain from an encounter with angels. However you want to articulate an encounter, I want to suggest that, bedtime Shema is a kind of encounter. It's a moment. Singing Shalom Aleichem on Friday night is a kind of encounter. And so I hope that some of these texts give you something to think about as you have those encounters. And I'm always happy to hear from you and hear more about your thoughts about angels. But I will end there, and thank you again so much for joining, and turn it back over to Liliana.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit, Sara. Already this has given me so much to think about and so much more context for my daily tefillah, and I'm looking forward to how this last class and the whole of it will continue to influence me going forward. So thank you so much for your amazing angel shirim, and I hope to see everyone again at more Drisha shirim. Keep your eyes open for more classes going forward. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you all. Bye, too. Bye-bye.